The Reynoso report reveals that a combination of a lack of leadership style determination, lack of a specific plan for dealing with protests, and a failure to take into account the ladders of inference of the self and others led to the negative outcome at UC Davis. Rutgers and other universities can learn from the mistakes of the UC Davis leadership team by making sure they implement the key features that the UCD leadership team lacked. There are 4 types of leadership that a group may choose to use. First, there's directive leadership, which is where there is only one leader who has complete command and control over the followers. In this type of leadership, the leader is the only one who is accountable for the entire group. The second type of leadership is the opposite of directive, which is laissez-faire. In this leadership, the leader allows his followers to think that they are in charge until he feels it is time to take charge and begin to give commands again. This is basically the opposite of directive until it turns right back into directive. There's a third type of leadership called facilitative leadership. Essentially, it's all about teamwork. There's a defined leader, but the team works as a group to make decisions. Distributed leadership is when there's a group of leaders who all work together to make a decision, and they are all held accountable for the group. The ladder of inference is basically the taken for granted and automatic way we put our thoughts into action. It's important for a person who is involved in a social movement to think about how they feel and why they feel that way while using objective data and acting on those thoughts, rather than letting emotion take the lead, which is where people get in trouble.
Well, it is the video seen around the world and tells an important chapter of the Occupy Wall Street story, that even when the protesters are peaceful, the police don't necessarily care. Now, you may have seen this video over the weekend, but it bears showing again. This video from the University of California at Davis.
Happening here? I want you to have the pepper spray in your face.
All right, so you see just how close these police officers are standing and spraying the students, some of whom were apparently trying to cover their faces with their clothing. The police officers actually forced open their mouths and pepper sprayed down their throats. So because of what you're seeing here, the UC Davis campus police chief, along with 2 officers, have been placed on administrative leave, paid leave, I should add. But students and faculty at Davis are now calling for the chancellor.
Have you been reading the news about all the protests in California and New York?
Of course, how could you not? It's all over the front page, man. I mean, it's just getting bad, man. I think the administrations just don't know how to properly deal with this, you know what I mean?
How would you deal with it?
I mean, listen, we're at State University, we have all these students, and the past few years we have been going through some protests. So how would I go about this? I think what we need as an administration is a better way of communication.
Exactly.
We need to walk down the ladder of inference.
Yeah. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so by ladder of inference, I'm referring to the ladder where we start to assume things and information about what the other person is saying. So the first step would start off by us gathering the information and based on the information, making assumptions about it. And by making those assumptions, we draw certain conclusions. And those conclusions lead to the actions.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is, without checking each other's assumptions, we get different. So based on those conclusions, we make different meanings of it.
Yeah.
So that's where people act differently than what was planned. So I think what we as an administration really needs is a process of checking each other's assumptions.
Exactly.
So like when you tell me something, I shouldn't just assume that what you're saying is right. Instead, I should be like, what do you mean by that? What are you assuming when you say that? Because when we put that process in our interactions, we won't lead to wrong actions. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We could lead to a more collective action where there are no confusions.
Yeah.
Because with assumptions not being made, there are no question marks. We don't have to guess things, you know, because people are certain about the expectations of each other.
Yeah.
So, how do you think we should go about implementing this new process to walk down the ladder?
Well, I like this new ladder if it's going down instead of up because in UC Davis case, they assumed all the time and it caused a lot of problems. So the first thing we should do is to get a group meeting with all the important people of the university and explain this new process. Instead of going up, we're going to go down.
Hi guys, welcome to the first meeting of the committee to avoid UC Davis occurrences. Thanks for coming. First things first, we need to decide which type of leadership we want to use. I watched this really informative video about all the types of leadership, and there's 4 types that we can pick from. There's directive, where there's one leader who gets in charge of all of us, and he's accountable for everything, or she. There's laissez-faire, which is like we kind of just let things go with the flow, and there's a leader to step in case he needs it, but he tries not to. And then there's, what was it, facilitative, which is when there's one leader, but we all work together to make decisions. And then there's distributed, which is there's multiple leaders all working together. Any thoughts?
I think we should do facilitative because we work so well together and we only need one leader.
Okay, so who wants to be the leader?
I do.
Okay.
Oh.
Well, why do you want to be a leader so bad?
Listen, all I know is that there needs to be a police representative within the leadership team, or as one of the leaders, because of the tactical knowledge that the police representative brings to the table. If you want to respond to the protesters and all these violent protests, we need the tactical knowledge and the background. That is why I think at least a police person should be one of the leaders. What do you guys think?
Hey, Officer Daniel, I agree with everything you said, but I think we should have an administrator also be a leader with you, because where does the protest happen at? It happens at our school, on our campus, and our main concern is our students. So that's why I believe that we should have one police officer and one administrator as a leadership.
Okay, I see your point.
Maybe we should have a distributed leadership strategy.
Distributed sounds good.
Yeah.
Right.
From the Kroll Report on page 14, in the absence of the NIMS/SEMS on November 18th, however, the roles and responsibilities were not defined and not well understood. This indicates that the leadership was not clearly defined by parties involved in the incident. Also on page 18, the operations plan identified Officer P as the incident commander and defined no role for Lieutenant Pike. Yet Lieutenant Pike appears to have made the command decision to use pepper spray. No one in a command position was in the Department Operations Center, which impaired coordination and communication. The leadership structure of the UCPD is very dysfunctional. Lieutenants refuse to follow directives of the chief. This breakdown is illustrated by the heated exchanges between the chief and her lieutenants as to the scope and conduct of the operation and the chief's apparent concession that her officers will do things their own way and that there is nothing she can do about it. This quote from page 19 indicates that the leadership structure was lacking. Before the protest even occurred, the leadership team was preparing for violence, which is evidenced in the Kroll Report when it says, indeed, a member of the campus leadership team sent an email to Campus Police Chief Spacuzza in November 2011, alerting her to a New York Times article describing the growing concerns of municipal authorities over health and safety issues involving the encampments. Even Chancellor Katahi explained, "We were very worried at the time because of the issues from Oakland being in the news." This quote shows how the campus had indeed been watching the way other protests were handled, which created a perceived norm that protests were out of control, which drove the leadership team to react the way they did.
Alright, good morning everybody. My name is Julian Romero, and I'm part of the leadership team with Officer Daniels here. Today we're having a very important meeting because we all know what's coming up, the protest. And right here we just have 4 steps of how to handle the protest if it does happen. Step number 1 is point of intervention. Step number 2, process of intervention. Step number 3 is definition of protocol. And step number 4 is repercussions. So I'm going to hand it off to Officer Daniels, the big guy over here, and he's going to explain each step. And here's the manual.
Alright guys, I'm really glad to join this meeting today with you guys, and I'll be just going over the very basics of the standard operating procedures that we just presented to you. So the first step, as you said, is the point of intervention. This step explains specifically when we step in, when the leadership team takes action. And that will depend on the situation at ground, and the specific details will be in the operating in the book. The second step is the process of intervention. This describes the specific actions that we take as the leadership team. And the first step would be the administrative personnel being sent to the site. And they will be simply notifying them of what would come up and what would happen if their actions persist. And if the action persists, then we'll send some policemen along with some administration personnel to warn them further. And the last step is the step we want to really avoid, but that's when we'll bring in the riot squad. And that's only for the purposes of crowd control and nothing more. And it should be noted that force should be used only when deemed necessary. And the steps and the details of when force should be used is also detailed in the guideline. And the third step would be the definitions and protocols. This step explains in detail of the various terms that we use in the protest response. For instance, social movements and student protest, violence, riot squad. All these important terms are explained very specifically so that the leadership team has a clear idea of when to act. And the last step is also very important, would be repercussions. This step actually explains what consequences the leadership team members will face if they fail to follow the specific standard operating procedures we just presented to you. So that's it, but I want to point out that it's a must that every member of the leadership team know the standard operating procedure by heart. We want to be familiar with it so we don't make any mistakes. So, thank you. The members of the UC Davis leadership team respectively walked up the ladder of inference during the planning process for the student protest. The prevalence of ladder of inference in their interactions is clearly observable when the leadership team was trying to figure out the use of force. On page 44 of the Kroll report, it says the only specific guidance provided by the leadership team to Chief Spikuza regarding the use of force by police occurred on the 1 p.m. call when Provost and Vice Chancellor Ralph Hexer said, "We don't want it to be like Berkeley," meaning that UC Davis did not want their officers to engage in force like the UC Berkeley officers employed on November 9th at the Sproul Plaza. According to Chancellor Katay, Hexer's guidance regarding Berkeley meant that there should be no violence. That's what it meant to me, to tell you the truth. Furthermore, she did not want to have arrests. According to Katay, it was clear in my mind and others that we wanted to remove the tents, and we wanted to do it without any violence, safely. These quotes show how the Chancellor made her own assumptions and drew conclusions based on those assumptions. On page 45 of the Kroll report, it says, the Chancellor Katay's understanding that no violence would be employed in the removal of the tents was not clear in the mind of Vice Chancellor Meyer, however. Meyer's interpretation of the Berkeley guidance was that some use of force by police would be acceptable in taking down the tents. When the Berkeley reference was mentioned, Meyer understood that to mean that the leadership team did not want the police to use batons. According to Meyer, he understood that there's an escalation of use of force, and that if I'm trying to bring someone out of the tent, or break a line physically by grabbing your arm and moving you apart, I think I understand that that was still allowable. These quotes show how walking up the ladder of inference contributed to the pepper spray incident.